The first thing I will say is that unfortunately we have generally seen a retreat in the role of Europe in general when it comes to the Arab world. It's not just Europe. Even the United States seems to have largely retreated when it comes to the Middle East at large, and the Arab world in particular. And this has opened the space for regional actors to play a more active role in the Arab world in particular. And here I'm talking about Turkey, Iran, as well as, of course, Arab actors like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, who all have regional ambitions. So the landscape in the Arab world has been changing slightly. It's no longer a case of the West in a way influencing things on the ground. If anything, people in the region are a bit critical that they have not received enough support from the West and Europe in particular, especially since 2011 when the uprisings in the region started. One thing that is now a crucial issue is the security angle. As you know, several countries in the region are in conflict. Libya, as mentioned, is one country that is now undergoing complete chaos. And that is partly because this enthusiasm on part of Europe to change the regime in Libya was not met with a viable security strategy aimed at stabilizing the country after the removal of Gaddafi. One reason behind this was lack of adequate understanding on part of the international community of the local dynamics in Libya. There was this sunny assumption that these rebels that had asked for international intervention would have the capacity to carry the country towards democratization. But of course, this missed the huge issue of the need for security sector reform and a security strategy to secure Libya before any of the political transition could actually be viable. So here, the role of Europe has been one of lack of understanding, unfortunately, and perhaps being too hasty in expecting transformation to happen. We shouldn't expect any country really to have a constitution ready in 6 months after having emerged from decades of autocracy. And I'm afraid that the same formula applies to other places in the region, not just Libya. And I think Egypt also demonstrates another situation in which we've seen this eternal optimism be hit with the harsh reality that, again, rushing a country to write a constitution and expecting it to just become democratic in a very short period of time is just not realistic. And what we've seen in Egypt in particular is a case of inattention by Europe to the importance of good governance when it comes to not just democratic transition, but in general. What I'm saying here is that the optimism that happened regarding Egypt after the 2011 uprising was coupled with turning a blind eye to the transgressions of the government that took over in Egypt at that time, which was an Islamist government led by the Muslim Brotherhood. This government tried to, in a way, Islamize the system. It engaged in transgressions at the human rights and freedom of expression levels, and yet everybody was saying, but no, this was a democratically elected government, so we should just support it. Well, yes, you should support a democratically elected government, but you should not do that without saying to any government that support should only happen if these governments abide by accountability, transparency, basically good governance values. Then we had a complete shift in Egypt with the change of regimes, with the current President Sisi, and unfortunately we saw the same process continue. Europe is still turning a blind eye to the transgressions happening in Egypt. In fact, in the UK, we saw President Sisi being welcomed at the same time as people being jailed in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood being cracked down on. So neither Islamists nor secularists, I don't think we should take sides when it comes to ideology, but what Europe should have done is stick by its own values. Unfortunately, we are once again seeing this formula of thinking that European values belong in Europe, and perhaps the rest of the world, can kind of abide by other values, and we ally ourselves with these other countries on the basis of security alliances primarily, and democracy suffers in the process. So this has been, unfortunately, a process that has been going on since before the Arab uprisings, and it's really unfortunate that Europe does not seem to have learned very much since those days. The other issue that is of crucial importance is that of the economy. Europe is very optimistic about one country in the region, and rightly so, which is Tunisia, because despite all the kind of sad stories that we are seeing in the region, here is one country that is actually on the path towards democratization. And yet, the democratization process in Tunisia risks being derailed because of the economy in the country, which is now at only 0.7% growth and expected to head to recession in the coming year. And yet, Europe has been very good at voicing moral and rhetorical support for the transition in Tunisia without creating economic strategies that would help this country kind of recover economically. And this is very important because the people in Tunisia have had such high expectations after the uprising that this new phase will bring prosperity to the country and stability, etc., that they have started to become rather disappointed because of the economic crisis. And actually, it's very normal for any country undergoing transition to have economic problems. And so the Tunisians are looking at Europe and again feeling a bit abandoned, feeling that they need more support that is not happening. And here I'm talking about trade, I'm talking about investment, the kinds of economic agreements that would help this country. Because if people feel disappointed with their everyday lives after a period of political change, then this risks them losing hope in democracy altogether. And unfortunately, some people already in Tunisia are beginning to say, well, at least during the days of Ben Ali, the ousted dictator, we made a good living, and now we're not, which is very unfortunate. The third issue I will raise is that of politics, hard politics, and here I'm talking in particular about Syria. Unfortunately, Syria is a country that has reached this sad state that it's in today largely as a result of the inattention of the international community. Very early on, after the Syrian uprising, when the uprising turned into a conflict, but before it became a full-blown war, there still could have been a diplomatic way out of the crisis. But the international community in general did not seem to have a vision for how to do this. And Europe in particular became very clear as an actor that was largely waiting for the United States to take a lead. The EU in particular became an institution that seemed to have very little political function when it came to the international relations of the Middle East. People saw that the EU was almost impotent, not really doing much to help this crisis find an end. And now, more than 4 years after the crisis started, we are beginning to see this huge wave of Syrians reach European shores, some of them alive, many of them dead. Unfortunately, until now, there have been 3,000 dead migrants in the Mediterranean, 70% of whom are Syrian. And so this state of affairs is a result of this conflict grinding on. And the reason why people are now starting to try to reach Europe in larger numbers than before is partly out of despair, because the people who are coming to Europe are not just coming from Syria itself, but also from Lebanon and Jordan, where a lot of Syrians have been seeking refuge over the last 4 years. And in these countries, these refugees have no rights. Their living conditions are dire, they are not allowed to work, and therefore they feel that they're simply wasting their lives. The young people who are educated, who are living in these countries, can only make do by working under the table in menial jobs, while the people with families don't want their children to be raised in this environment and become either members of criminal gangs or perhaps terrorist groups or die of starvation. And so they feel that even though there's a risk of death, trying to reach Europe is better than staying where they were. And so here again, Europe's political retreat has directly impacted the humanitarian situation in the Arab world, as you can see, and I'm talking about Syria in particular. So unfortunately, the perspective from the region regarding Europe is largely one of despair, disappointment, feeling of abandonment, and here, as you can see, we're talking about security, we're talking about the economy, and we're talking about politics. Thank you.
I promise you an interesting exchange, because I must say I would take issue with a couple of points that Lina has made. It's always more interesting, I think, for the audience when the speakers agree on everything. There's not much to debate. And I'll just mention briefly what they are. First of all, as you'll see in a few moments, the European Union has devoted many, many years, and I would say misguidedly, to democracy promotion in different forms in North Africa and in the Levant. I'll describe that very briefly. And it's not as if the European Union institutions especially have not sought to do this. There's been a very active policy on that for more than a decade. And secondly, I think the implicit model behind much that Lina said was the expectation that outside actors would come in and would somehow transform the situation within these countries, whereas in fact I think what the United States and the Europeans have learned over the last 10 or 15 years, whether in Eastern Europe, whether in Ukraine or in Syria or in North Africa, is that an indispensable condition for transformation of societies is what is called more and more local ownership. The political forces within the countries themselves must embrace the objectives, and if they don't, then the effort to impose change, even pro-democracy change from outside, I think is doomed to failure. Beginning in 2003, 2004, after the relatively successful experience with Hungary, with the Czech Republic, with Estonia, with Poland, and the various other countries that had overthrown communism, the EU then in 2003, 2004 said to itself, but what about the countries surrounding the European Union who are not destined to become members? And so the EU developed a policy for the whole of the southern and eastern Mediterranean, in which basically it spent a decade negotiating with these countries, still under the Ancien regime, before the Arab uprisings, getting them to commit themselves to certain reforms, to sign up for them, and in exchange offering a certain number of incentives, financial incentives, but also, in the words of the former Italian Prime Minister Romano Prodi, offering to bring them closer to the European Union, to offer them everything short of actually being members. A very, very ambitious policy that gave rise to hope around the Mediterranean, that the EU really sought to embrace its neighbors and to help them move ahead and to help them too into a transition process which would bring about democratic reforms. Now, this policy was pursued actively beginning in 2004 with the goal of creating a ring of well-governed states around the European Union. In the words of the Charlemagne columnist in The Economist magazine about 6 months ago, he said that instead of creating a ring of well-governed states, we now faced a ring of fire. And I think the reason for this lies partly within the countries concerned, predominantly within the countries concerned, but also because the policy that we were pursuing was misguided, and I think misguided for a number of reasons. First of all, we did not really have a legal standing or a right to propose intrusive reforms in these countries without offering them membership, without having some basis for interfering effectively in their internal affairs, as we had with the candidates for membership. We offered actually rather far-reaching financial support. We set up a bank, especially to promote infrastructure projects, grant assistance to support civil society, a whole range of projects. But taken together, the incentive provided for these was clearly not sufficient. We also had a complicated, tangled web of initiatives. I won't repeat all the acronyms to you, but whether the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership or the Union for the Mediterranean, the Partnership for Democracy and Shared Prosperity, any number of initiatives that created confusion. But I think the most serious failing, and Lina did in fact refer to this indirectly, was the fact that the member states of the European Union, most of which have long-standing, traditional, in many cases post-colonial links with these countries, basically organized their relations with them on the basis of traditional foreign policy objectives, promoting trade, investment, security, access to resources. In a number of cases, countries like Algeria and Libya clearly were very important in terms of hydrocarbons. In other words, traditional foreign policies. And during this period, they delegated to the institutions in Brussels the promotion of democracy. And we therefore pursued this policy that I've described to you, but without the full support of our member states. There were a number of occasions when this was evident. At the very start of this policy, for example, the former French President Chirac visited Tunisia. So just as the EU was selling a package of reforms to these countries, he visited Ben Ali, the former dictator, and said that from his point of view, the most important human rights were the right to food and to lodging, and that from this perspective, Tunisia was doing pretty well. So if you had this kind of message coming from the French president, how could the Tunisian regime or any of the other regimes take seriously the kind of tough political conditionality that Brussels was trying to impose? And we've seen this throughout the process. In 2000, and the engagement that we tried during those years were with the former dictators. So, for example, President Mubarak was, together with former French President Sarkozy, the co-presidents of the Union for the Mediterranean. So there was a real effort to engage with these ancien regime, but relatively poor results. Then, beginning in Tunisia in December 2010, with the Arab uprisings, how did this look in Brussels? Well, in Brussels, people said, well, it's happening again. This is as if the Berlin Wall had fallen for a second time. We've done this before. We know how to do it. This is like another year of Europe. And so the EU then, in fact, jumped in with a series of initiatives that were modeled very, very closely on our policies in Central and Eastern Europe. In fact, it was almost a carbon copy of the kind of very ambitious agreements that we negotiated with countries in Central and Eastern Europe that we then proposed to these countries. And the EU then spent several years providing financial support, providing technical assistance, infrastructure investment, and advice about transition. However, there were new kids on the block. We were not the only influences in these countries, and we could not or should not have taken for granted that the predominant motivation of people in these countries was to become more like ourselves. This was in fact the case in Central and Eastern Europe. The return to Europe of Václav Havel, the solidarity in Poland. However, other countries were active on the same terrain, whether the Gulf countries that were providing financial support that far exceeded our own, without the kind of Western political conditionality to pro-democracy that we imposed. To give you an example, EU grant assistance to Egypt over a 5-year period, around 800 million. Support from the Gulf countries over 2 years, there are different figures, depends how you count it, but of the order of 4 billion, and without the kind of strings that we were attaching to it. So there were the Gulf countries that were active. Russia, in various not very constructive ways, became involved. The Chinese, investing large amounts in infrastructure, buying up ports, providing funds for investment with no political strings. Others too, the Turks, with their own agenda, a candidate for EU membership, but still pursuing goals which some have described as sort of Sunni supremacist goals, which were rather different in nature from the EU's. So I think because the EU and its member states did not speak with one voice, because we wrongly assumed that there was a transition process underway very similar to the one that we had dealt with relatively successfully in Central and Eastern Europe, because there were other influences in these societies, including conservative values. There were transnational groups with sectarian objectives, using violent means that we had no means to address. And then, as Lina had said, we lacked the diplomatic tools, the unity, the capacity, or in my view, even the standing, to try and impose from outside either reforms within the countries or diplomatic solutions to very complex problems of the sort that we've seen in Syria. So we are now, in a sense, reaping the whirlwind of all of this with the outpouring of refugees, particularly from Syria, but I should point out not only from Syria. The 160,000 or so refugees that have arrived in Italy this year from Libya are predominantly from sub-Saharan and Eastern Africa, from the Sudan, from Somalia, from Eritrea, earlier on some from Mali. The refugees entering the EU through Turkey are predominantly now from Syria, but also from Afghanistan and from other countries to the east, with Turkey acting as a transit route into Europe through Greece. So we now face a refugee crisis on an unprecedented scale that comes on top of 3 other existential crises that the EU is facing. The still unresolved euro crisis that you're going to be discussing here in the coming days, the Russia-Ukraine question that has been pushed onto the back burner willfully on the part of Russia in the light of the situation in Syria, but still remains a fundamental problem facing Europe. The risk that one of the EU's major member states, the one that I know best, the United Kingdom, might withdraw. And the refugee crisis has created new rifts between countries that previously worked together, like Poland and Germany, that were becoming much closer, but now on the refugee issue find themselves in different camps. Mrs. Merkel, who has been championed as the real political leader of Europe in the absence of strong leadership in many other countries, I think is now being called into question in her own country. I think she'll survive. I don't think there's any very serious competition within Germany, but still her very open and welcoming policy towards the refugees, which in human terms is very heartwarming and has helped to redress the image of Germany that there was in Greece, for example, during the Euro crisis as being very hard-hearted, nonetheless was her own policy. It wasn't thoroughly coordinated within Germany itself, nor was it coordinated with other EU member states, who now reproach Germany for offering such a welcome without putting into place the capacity fully to receive the refugees. In any event, Europe's strongest leader, Angela Merkel, is finding herself probably in the most difficult position she has since the start of her period in office as German Chancellor. So these issues that we're discussing this evening, very important as they are in their own right, and concerning the countries themselves, and with a huge human cost and cost in human suffering, also feed into the other principal challenges that the European Union is facing. So I think we're in for a very hot time in the years ahead. Thank you.